lot of people are still plagued and perplexed by Richard Nixon and what happened. Could you shed a little bit of light on what really happened? Was it really just a matter of a little break-in there? I mean, it seems so extreme for this man to lose the presidency. What was really going on?
Well, I tell you, there's several factors at work, but basically it all came down, when all was said and done, it had really nothing to do. You know, Richard Nixon was far from perfect. I'm not here to say Richard Nixon was the best thing since sliced bread, and he did a lot of things in the presidency that he shouldn't have. But the whole Watergate thing was, and let's just be candid about it, it was a Jewish Zionist conspiracy from the get-go. I've written about this in Final Judgment, actually, rather than in the Judas Goods.
Yes, that's true.
I think I allude to it in the Judas Goods. So what was happening in the beginning of Richard Nixon's second term was that Nixon had determined that he was going to clean house. Nixon had come to realize he had been in the circles of power here in the United States, obviously, for many years. And as we now know from some of the tapes that have come out, Richard Nixon had some very set opinions about Jewish power and influence in this country.
The 500 hours of tapes released today showing what one historian calls Nixon's own dark view of how the world works, where the enemy is not just the communists, it's also the media.
After his re-election, his overwhelming re-election in 1972, he was beginning to make efforts in one particular area that very few people are unaware of. He was determined to reassess and reestablish and recreate the federal bureaucracy in Washington. He wanted to eliminate many of the longtime Jewish career bureaucrats who were in high-level and mid-level positions of power in the bureaucracy. And this is one of the things that he was planning to do. He was literally planning to clean house. In addition, he was determined to force the Zionist state of Israel to a major sit-down in the Middle East and solve the problems of the region. And he had back-channel operations going on to the Palestinians and to the king of Saudi Arabia, who was very anti-Zionist. And they were basically, what Nixon was saying was, we are going to force Israel and the Zionists to sit down, and we're going to sort this all out. Well, Richard Nixon, of course, had Henry Kissinger in as his Secretary of State. But Nixon was doing these things behind Kissinger's back. And when Kissinger found out about it, Kissinger started to do everything he could to undermine Nixon. Now, this is information that can be found in mainstream sources, but you have to put it all together to understand the bigger picture of what was happening. It had reached a point, the struggle behind the scenes between Nixon and Kissinger and the Zionist lobby, that Nixon told people, he sent a message to the king of Saudi Arabia. He said, in my next State of the Union address, which would have been in 1975, he said, in my next State of the Union address, I'm going to tear up my prepared address and go before the American people on television and radio and explain to them precisely how the Jews are interfering with our foreign policy, and I'm going to call for the American people to join me in trying to break the back of this conspiracy. Now, I'm, of course, paraphrasing. This isn't exactly what Nixon said, obviously, but this is actually what he was promising to do. Well, in the meantime, of course, the Watergate scandal erupted, and what's very, very interesting is that Deborah Davis, a Jewish girl, wrote a very interesting book about the history of the Washington Post. And in that book, she presents a very, very strong case, which indicates that it was that the famous Deep Throat was not this guy Mark Felt, who everybody now says was Deep Throat. This is an old, senile old man, I'm sorry to say, who they put a book out in his name and made claims for a guy that really couldn't, tell the truth one way or the other, I'm sorry to say. But needless to say, Deborah Davis makes it very, very clear that the Watergate operation and the spying on Richard Nixon was being carried out by a desk in a CIA desk in the White House, which was run by James Angleton. James Angleton was the CIA's liaison to the Mossad. In fact, Miss Davis refers to this desk in the White House as literally an Israeli counterintelligence desk. So what we had was the Watergate operation. The spying on Nixon was being run by Israeli sympathizers in the CIA. They were determined to get Nixon out of there, and that whole Watergate burglary, which was used to bring him down, was obviously deliberately bungled. The intent was for these people to be caught, and of course then the media joined in the chorus against Richard Nixon.
The press was the enemy. The press is the enemy. The establishment is the enemy. The professors are the enemy. The professors are the enemy. Write that in the blackboard 100 times and never forget.
But this attack emanated from the privileged sanctuary of a network studio and therefore had the apparent dignity of an objective statement. The American people would rightly not tolerate this concentration of power in government. Is it not fair and relevant to question its concentration in the hands of a tiny, enclosed fraternity of privileged men elected by no one and enjoying a monopoly sanctioned and licensed by government? The views of a majority of this fraternity do not, and I repeat, not represent the views of America.
And, Nixon in many respects made mistakes in terms of trying to contain the scandal, and that only made it worse for him. But basically what we saw with Watergate was a Zionist operation to discredit Richard Nixon and to run him out of the White House. And what's very, very interesting is that Vice President Spiro Agnew, who also managed to get himself in trouble over a related thing, and incidentally, just as an aside, those were Jewish businessmen from Maryland who were the ones who gave the testimony that implicated Spiro Agnew in corruption. And if you read Spiro Agnew's book, it's pretty clear that he was set up. But in his book, Agnew says very, very specifically that one of the major forces in the whole Watergate affair was the Zionist influence. Spiro Agnew told people this, including former Congressman Paul Finley and others, that he definitively believed that it was Zionism that was the prime mover behind the whole Watergate mess. So that's what we had here. The Zionists assassinated Richard Nixon just as much as they assassinated John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, and it's interesting because in those tapes, Nixon also tells Haldeman, his chief of staff, and Billy Graham, the evangelist, that talks about the satanic Jews involved in the conspiracy, and Billy Graham fully agreed with him. And Billy Graham said to Richard Nixon, the president, said, "Mr. President, after you're elected for your second term, maybe you can do something about these satanic Jews."
Well, I told you one time that the Bible talks about two kinds of Jews. One is called the synagogue of Satan. They're the ones putting out the pornographic literature. They're the ones putting out these obscene films.
But this stranglehold has got to be broken, or this country is going to go down the drain. Yes, sir. I can't say it, but I believe it. No, but if you have elected the second time, you might be able to do something.
Nixon thought he was going to be able to do. Nixon, was the guy was a scrapper. He was a fighter. He was a street fighter, and he figured, I'm president of the United States and I have the power to do it. And Tex, where he misjudged things, where he made a bad gamble. He didn't consider the power of the media. He did not consider the Jewish power over the media. And had it not been, even the media itself, they crow and they gloat that they were the ones who brought down Richard Nixon, and that is exactly who did bring down Richard Nixon, the Jewish media.
Sure. And they used two reporters for the Washington Post that is a Jewish-owned organ itself, and both the reporters are Jews. So
that's right.
And then the Daniel Ellsberg, he was a Jew in the Pentagon with the Pentagon Papers. The whole thing was a Jewish conspiracy to get Richard Nixon and.
Those were Jews, Roosevelt were Jews. But there are men. His was not a Jew. So that proves something.
Am I wrong to say it was basically a coup d'etat?
That's exactly what it was. It was as much of a coup d'etat as the coup d'etat that took place in Dallas. The only difference is that Richard Nixon survived physically, but he will go down in history. He is remembered, thanks to the media, as a corrupt president. And he may not have been the most honest man in the world, but he was no more corrupt than anybody else who's ever been in the White House.
He actually looked physically shaken his last days. I believe he was afraid for his life, maybe the lives of his wife and children. At the end there, they may have threatened him to such an extent.
He fought to the last, but there was no way. Let's face it, there was no way that he could have ever come out of it. And if necessary, they might have killed him.
In a book entitled Go Quietly or Else, Agnew says he left because of a death threat from the White House. He quotes Nixon Chief of Staff Alexander Haig, urging him to resign with the words, "The president has a lot of power. Don't forget that." Agnew writes that the remark sent a chill through his body. He took it as an innuendo that anything could happen. He might have, in Agnew's words, a convenient accident, an interpretation that even today he refuses to disown.
I didn't know what General Haig meant when he said anything may be in the offing. Things may get nasty and dirty. All I knew was that he tried on 5 separate occasions in 2 months to force my resignation at the same time that President Nixon was publicly stating that he still had confidence in me and that I should not be forced to resign.
You think then that there were men around Richard Nixon, either in the White House staff or in the official mechanism of the CIA, who were capable of killing a vice president of the United States if they felt he was an embarrassment?
I don't doubt that at all.
Did you see evidence of this cold-bloodedness within the administration during the years you were working with it? That impression must be based on something, because to many of us it's a horrific notion.
Well, the intelligence community, of course, is a very clandestine community. And while I was privy to briefings and the usual method of operation of the intelligence community, I never got into any specific information because this is very closely held business. I don't doubt that these things could happen.
I have to be very cautious because Hunt and Liddy and Crow and Caulfield, the Watergate, they're all ex-CIA, those guys, They're ex-this and they're ex-that. And those bastards, they know where the bodies are buried, see, so I couldn't just go running in there and do any goddamn thing I want.
That's the history of the thing, I've given here just today just a very brief thumbnail sketch of what happened, but as I say, it's all very carefully documented in Final Judgment, in my book Final Judgment, the whole story of Watergate there. So it's all part and parcel, coming back to the Judas goats. It's all part and parcel of how infiltrators can manipulate things, because that's what happened. The guys in the CIA who deliberately bungled the Watergate burglary, they were Judas goats.
Yeah.
They were there pretending to be on Nixon's side, but in fact they were setting him up.
Now this Jesus James Angleton, the deputy director of the CIA, who this was the guy that after he left office and died in this high position in the CIA, it came out that some of the defectors from Soviet communism, he actually turned back over to the communists, and they were slaughtered.
Angleton was a very enigmatic individual who many believe was actually, for years Angleton was running around talking about the necessity of finding the mole, the Soviet mole inside the CIA.
Yes.
A lot of people in the CIA believe that it was Angleton who was that mole.
So the mole was looking for the mole.